Well, thanks everyone for joining and yeah, braving the storm for those of us in person. So I know we talked about having this meeting here at the end of July to kind of get our list solidified so that we can bring it to the larger committee and kind of have a discussion there. I did see the email from Libby Garvey about only having 3 priorities from each advisory commissions. I don't know if that changes things for us.
Isn't she leaving?
Well, yeah, in January. But she gave guidance to all the commission chairs and said, like, I'd like your legislative priorities by what's November 27th, I think is the date. And I missed the part when I skimmed it that she only wanted 3 from each.
And then they think that that's not great.
Yeah, I could just skip the.
Said where I thought it said something about there's like there are only each legislator is only going to be able to introduce 15 bills.
Of the top 3 actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we can do more than 3. Like she's recommending 3. Yeah, certainly it's something to consider.
So last year we had 7.
No, we had 4.
Okay, so we would only do 1. Okay. Yeah, so the list that I have, Kellen, is still that draft list. I don't know if you said that there was like, I know our last meeting, you said there was a more updated list, but I wasn't actually able to find that.
Okay.
I can share my screen.
Is that the one that was sent on 7/23?
This is the same list we worked off of the last meeting. And I know Jason sent, so.
Does this include the ones that we added at the last meeting?
It should, yes.
Hi, this is Doris.
Doris.
Hi.
Hi. Unfortunately, the storms kind of prevented me from getting transportation as quickly as I wanted.
Got it.
Doris, go a little quieter. Yeah, because I know we added some at the meeting, like we added rent stabilization, we added some other ones.
Yeah, let me see it. I was trying to send things to my work computer so I can share my screen. This document.
When did the email go out that included Libby Garvey's?
Oh, she just sent that to me.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, it was just an email to all the commission chairs.
Got it.
well, maybe while I'm trying to pull this up, do we want to go through your list, Jason? I think that
Oh, sure.
I can share that.
Worst comes to worst. You can do with your words.
I'm trying to pull up his list on this computer because I actually have Teams on that one. But my email's being slow. Like I said.
Didn't Joe suggest?
Yeah, we definitely have a few.
Yeah.
This was like my notes one, but I think I have one that I mentioned.
Who want to start discussion?
Yeah, I'm gonna pull up his list and we can do that while I keep trying to look for the other items. Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, so, I sent around, 4 different recommended legislations and then also some discussion on rent stabilization. If we want to have that discussion later tonight. But I'll just go with the first recommendation is the Faith and Housing in Commonwealth Act, which was currently introduced last year in the Virginia at the statewide legislative session. And right now it's currently in the work group in the Virginia Housing Commission. And what this bill would essentially do is permit any religious organization defined in the bill or nonprofit to build subsidized affordable housing on their land. The idea would be it would set minimum parameters that localities could like limit to. You can't say like lot coverage like 10% or something. So you had to be a certain standard. I think that this bill, there's many ways that it could be tailored to different localities to make it more palatable across the state. Such as not necessarily make it legal, but provide other avenues to essentially expedite the development of this sort of housing that fits within these parameters. And I just noted there's another bill like this in California SB4, and this would not be exactly the same, but in the same sort of guidelines tailored to Virginia localities.
Yeah, so I also definitely support this. I was meeting with some leaders from Voice, which is the interfaith group, on Saturday, and they are supporting this. There are many congregations that want to build affordable housing in Arlington, and it's just difficult, as we know from Clarendon Presbyterian, as well as I work in Maryland, and they passed a similar law just this year at the state as part of this state housing act that they passed, just to make it bonus density for if you're building affordable housing, if you're a nonprofit or congregation. And then Montgomery County also passed even more provisions to make it easier. And I know that, last year maybe the bill wasn't written the most, in the way that made most sense, but they're going to work on, trying to make sure this year it incorporates like things that would make it helpful for Arlington.
Okay, so I was thinking like taxes wise, like religious organizations tax. How was that like, is that even being addressed? Like they have this like real estate, like a majority ownership interest to get money, but how are they like if that ever came up.
Confused.
So like religious organizations aren't taxed. So if they're doing this, which is great, and they're gonna be, I guess, I'll just like, that's my only concern. Like they have a lot of,
What is it about the taxes you're concerned about?
yeah, like, how is that going to, like sometimes they have prime real estate for some of these places. And like housing. I'll think of my question a little bit more on that. I don't think it's bad. I'm just that's what I'm saying with like organizations owning so much with and in my own personal religious background, that the church is on really high prime real estate. Which could build more affordable housing, not attached to a religious organization. Like my thing is, are they going to have parameters in their housing? I think not, because of their housing.
I mean, I think it would be, so my understanding is the bill says, like the Our Lady of Affordable Housing in Clarendon, what's the church?
Clarendon Presbyterian.
Not that, the one that already exists, right at the metro.
And it what?
At the Boston Metro?
No. The one, they've been there for like 10 years.
The church at
It's got the
Clarendon?
church in the front and it's got a big affordable housing building on
Is it
top of it.
the church at Clarendon?
I think it.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, so they, what this bill would have done is instead of having to go through the regular site plan process, where you had all the neighbors from Lion Village, I always confuse them, straight. Lion Village, hating on the project, saying this is too much development in our neighborhood. We support affordable housing, but not here. And so it just drags out the process, and they have to make all those compromises to like get the neighbors to be less angry about it. This would say, hey, by right, correct me if I'm wrong, you can build affordable housing, and it kind of streamlines the process. They don't have to go through all those approval steps, and they don't have to worry about the community saying, like, we want our little church here, we don't want affordable housing here, and we're going to fight this for the next 3 years. That's what this is trying to prevent from happening. So it doesn't get into anything about taxes, because it would still be like church-owned property. But it would just be like, instead of just church, now it's a church.
And also, I think to your point about religious requirements for living there.
Yeah.
I don't think they usually do that. In fact, a lot of times they'll actually sell the property to like APA or some nonprofit developer, and they're the ones who actually manage it. So I think that would also be something they would want to include in the bill, would be not only if the church owns it, but if they sell it to APA or a nonprofit developer, then you'd still want it to qualify.
Or would it be like, okay.
Yeah, to answer your question, they are, it looks like, exempt from like property taxes. So I just looked up like Clarendon Presbyterian, like their assessment value for that, their entire property is 1.3 million. It's like it. Yeah. So the only payments, it's like 1,500. I mean, that's the loss.
Yeah, but with office, the market, like that's what they're exempt from it. But need that money to fund other things, and it's just like,
That I don't think we're gonna.
Yeah.
I don't think the county board is interested in what we have to say about whether or not churches should pay taxes. But I think this bill is really just around, we want to make it easier for churches to redevelop their property into affordable housing. Because right now, it's really tough because the neighbors push back and say, we don't want this.
I think the worry could be, oh, you now have approved, and then you sell it. And then, so I think maybe that's what you're saying. Like, let's say right now their property's worth 1.4 million, and if they redevelop that, that's gonna be, you have 100 units, that's gonna be 100 or not,
Yeah, it'd be
50
a
plus
lot
million
more.
that you sell, and then that could be, maybe there could be something about selling it. Like, I think.
I mean, I guess it's fine. Yeah, like,
In Maryland, what was the opposition? Like, was there any opposition?
Us passing this.
Or this past session, the
Um,
previous bill, that sounds like it was a contract. Oh,
Yeah, I actually don't know what the opposition was. It sounds like just in general in Maryland, they have a very pro-housing governor and, they were able to get it passed, so.
In Virginia, through this dying committee, where,
Yeah, I think they said they like bumped it to next year, is that right?
oh, okay,
Yeah.
Yeah,
which is like a polite way of killing something.
yeah,
I think part of the challenge is localities, they hate this because they feel like it's a state telling them how to zone and like use their land. So
these have been like our county board might eat it too.
Yeah,
Potentially.
they won't like it.
they don't like,
Publicly, they won't.
yeah, they don't like the state telling them how to do zoning. So like we have very few powers that we control locally, and zoning is one of them, and we don't want the state coming in and taking away some of that. Because what's unclear to me is how much of this the county board can already do. Like, can they already make it by right for churches to redevelop, or is that something that maybe the state government can do? Like, that's unclear to me.
I can see that where, I mean, people can create a religious organization, buy property, and then like skip all that other stuff. And
But they're not making money off of this really, because it's still like, they still have to commit to having it be affordable for a certain number of years to even be eligible for it. So it's not like they could just, hey, we're gonna build affordable housing, and then they build it and like, psych, we're gonna sell it now and make $50 million. Like it
well,
would
they
have
would
to
do
stay-
like a ground lease, whoever's managing it for like 9 years. Like everyone's out to make money. They're not gonna make money off it. Off their property.
I think typically, like, why churches do this is because attendance is declining, and they're like, we can't afford to pay the upkeep of our existing structure. So it'd be cheaper for them to redevelop in partnership with like HEPA or HC or something, and have affordable housing there. They're like, we really only need a much smaller footprint for the church, and this way we can also help the community. And financially, it balances out their books. I don't know too much more detail than that because I haven't like looked at all the finances, but that's my understanding of like why all these churches are doing it. Because they're like, when the church was built, we had, a congregation that was like 10 times the size it is today. And today they're like, we have these big church buildings and very few people using them. And they're like, it's not a good use of the space. And so many of them want to redevelop for affordable housing because they know that we're in desperate need of that. And that will also save the church building, because otherwise they'd have to sell the property to a private developer who just built like mansions or something. So affordable housing allows them to keep the property, have a smaller footprint for the church, and also help the community. So I'm not opposed to it. There's some questions that I wish we had some answers to. And I'm not sure who's the best person to answer. We don't have the other, like Richard Tucker or anyone on.
No.
Like they would probably know the answer to the question about whether the county board could do this now without the state doing it.
We have it, but don't we have a religious land use code?
That I have no idea.
Well, I know, because it's Well, so this, like, current Presbyterian right now is an R5 zone, so I don't know if there's an overlay. I mean, probably could, but timeline of that.
I mean, if you'd like me, I could reach out to Richard Tucker or try to do some research and find out the answer to that question.
Sure, yeah. That would be helpful.
I bet.
Because I think it's, again, like, if we're gonna propose it as something to take to Richmond, I'd like to first establish that the board doesn't already have the authority to do it now, and they just don't want to.
Yeah.
Because if they don't want to do it and they already have the authority, they're certainly not gonna want to, like, ask the general subcommittee, please give us the authority.
Building off that point, but like, if we only get a limited number of priorities and we know they're not gonna like this, like my housing advocate had, I think, yes, but like, we're now in this advisory role, like, if we already know they're not gonna like it, doesn't make sense necessarily. This is a question, this is not me saying, like, do we wanna put this on the list, just knowing, like, the politics of it? I think it's something to think about.
I mean, could we put it on the list, but at the bottom? And like, we have our top 3 type of thing?
I mean, we could. I mean, I don't think we should remove it from consideration. I think we should, if we can do some more research, and then next time we meet, like, report back on that, have a discussion, and then we can figure out, like, what's the final list we want to present to the full commission at the September meeting. But I think we should meet on this, another meeting to just go through stuff.
There's also, I mean, do we want just Arlington to do this, or do we want this to be a statewide thing? Because I'm obviously, like, Arlington, do we want, like, depending on whether we have this power or not, like, I think part of the point of some of these statewide compelling override of local is to get regional approach. So it's like, you don't have Fairfax does one thing, and Alexandria, if you have a church in Alexandria, you can do it in Arlington. So, but that's a hard thing because I'm not sure how attuned the recommendations. I mean, obviously the county board, they're concerned about Arlington, but the effects of what goes on in Fairfax or in Alexandria, DC, and Montgomery, Maryland also affect funds.
And if it was just like, currently the county board does not have the authority to specifically change zoning requirements and make stuff by right versus not for churches, and this bill would give them that authority, and it was only applicable to Arlington, they may be receptive to that if it's giving them more authority than they currently have. But yeah,
I don't think this bill is giving authority. I think it's saying you must create the authority within your zoning code. So I think that's the intent, not the.
But we can recommend whatever we want. So if we don't agree with the bill as it was before,
Yeah.
we can always propose, county board, you should work with our delegation to do something different.
Or even, is there a possibility for receiving certain, I know we talked about tax benefits, but more tax benefits to make it more feasible, or if you do within a certain amount of time, you have to look if a church or other religious propose it, you have to look at it within certain days. There's other things that aren't like you must approve it. Maybe you can soften it a little bit. Just take a look at it. It's been 60 days.
I mean, it could be like prioritizing tax credits for like church projects, like for redevelopment, affordable housing projects on church properties or something, or creating new ones. So yeah, that's why this stuff is tough.
And then also with this limited short session, like, is this, like, do we know who the sponsor? If they're only getting 15 each.
Well, I would assume whoever sponsored it last year, in theory, would sponsor it.
I think so.
Yeah.
Hashmi. Not sure who the house sponsors this.
But I think there's a good likelihood, if the county board really wants a bill introduced, that they'll convince one of our senators, delegates, that they sponsor it.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, I'm not familiar with this, like, short session. Bills. Very good.
It's just, yeah, so every other year, it's 90 days versus 60. And so this year we're going into the 60-day session.
Okay.
And because they're like, we have literally a month less time to do everything, then they put much more strict limits on how many bills you can introduce. Because they just physically don't, they
Right,
don't
don't
have
have
enough
the
time
time.
to consider as many bills.
I'll talk about the next one. Okay. Next one is about accessory dwelling units. So this bill was in the House and the Senate. Again, last session, it did pass on the floor of the Senate, but it did not make it out of committee in the House. And originally it was, again, one of these state telling localities you must have a ADU ordinance in place by a certain amount of date. That was the original bill, but it did get I guess softened up a little bit to be a little bit less, more permissive grading to the localities in terms of what you can attach to it, parking requirements, permitting fees, things of that nature. So currently this is going through, I think it has its own work session in the Virginia Housing Commission this summer. I don't think they have met specifically on this yet. But based on, I don't think Arlington would have really any, I don't think this would really change any of Arlington's ADU policy, but there's, I know, some concerns in Fairfax that some of the provisions would override their current provisions based on what they just passed. So that would be a concern from localities.
So how does this differ from what Arlington already has in place?
I think it would be less, like, I think in terms of like like the setbacks or occupancy, main owner, I think I'm not sure the full details in the bill in terms of what it requires localities to do. I know that they did add a lot of provisions to make it less forceful, like you can't add in all these things, but I don't think that what would be in this bill, because it would affect every single locality across Virginia, would like make Arlington have to change our ADU policy to be like, okay, we have to change instead of like, set the minimum lot size or whatever would have to change. I think this bill would just say you have to have one by a certain amount of time. You get like a year or two to implement it. If you don't, then you automatically take the base ADU policy.
So if we already have this, how does this help Arlington residents?
So this would essentially compel places like this is why Fairfax was perhaps against it, because it could essentially let localities in Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, especially like Loudoun County, I don't think has an ADU policy yet, so that they could have essentially a by right process for ADUs. And it would be a stepping stone to, again, going towards the state to promote regional approach to housing to increase the available housing across Fairfax County, Arlington, Alexandria, Prince William, and Stafford and beyond. So it would be a small impact because Arlington property owners, they wouldn't have much of impact, but there could be a case where this is in place and then whatever, a couple years goes by, they want to increase it. Arlington hasn't yet, for whatever reason they want to see more ADUs permitted. The state that's changed policy to make it easier to get ADUs.
This one doesn't rise to the top for me of things that we should go after, because I think if we didn't have an ADU policy in place already, and we've gone through 2 iterations of it, then I could see more like pushing. Although I feel like the push would be more on the county board to approve one versus asking them to ask the General Assembly to. I just feel like this one would be tough to justify as like a top priority for the Housing Commission for Arlington because, well, minimal impact on Arlington. So, well, then why are we pushing for it? If we were a state housing commission, I could see more why we'd want to go after it, but I don't know thoughts from other people.
Yeah, I agree. And it would be another one, right, where the state is prohibiting them from doing something like call to the slide. I don't know. I want to have like 2 of those there. But yeah, I mean, if it's not going to have a large impact on Arlington residents, I think the argument is harder to make, just in general, on top of the fact that we have something similar. So,
And regionally too, as part of the regional fair housing plan, like all the localities in Northern Virginia did adopt as goals having ADU policies in place. So in theory, they should be moving towards that because they agreed to do it. But yeah, I think from a regional perspective, like that helps push them in that direction. I mean, it's not a mandate, but they have agreed to it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I would agree.
What was the email of the priorities from last year?
So you can also find them on our website.
Oh,
Like if you just look at, Alex, was it?
The month from last year.
Yeah, it was, 'cause I have the letter printed out, September 21st, so it'd be September, our September 14th meeting. That has the letter of the 4 that we actually pushed last year. Yeah, I think we brought 10 potentially to the commission, and then we narrowed it down to 4. Not like about single stair.
Yes, yes. So next one is single stair, which does not have the bill yet. However, last year there was a bill that did pass unanimously and signed into law that would do a study, which is taking place right now to study the use of single stair apartment buildings up to 6 stories. Right now, if you want to build a single stair dwelling, you cannot go above 3 stories. And I think the commercial buildings, once you hit 4 units in a building, it goes into the commercial code, which is what this bill would change. So right now the study is coming out. There'll be a recommendation in the wintertime about kind of the path forward. The single stair buildings can be changed through the building code, which can be a non-legislative process. However, the legislature does have the power to compel, I guess, the people doing the building code to suggestions or forceful actions to actually change the code. But I know there's been the big topic of this that, originally the bill was kind of there to not do a study, but to actually compel to, make this a change in the building code. But because, some legislatures, they don't want to legislate the building code, factors that it would have various impacts. They're commissioning a study which has people from housing, it has firefighters, it has architects, all sorts of people involved in looking at the impacts of single stair dwellings. So this suggestion here would be to, take perhaps whatever recommendation comes out in December and provide kind of next step to advance or vote whenever the next cycle is, or even before, to legalize single stair buildings. There are a couple of places where this is happening both at the state level and municipalities across North America. I think Toronto actually just voted to allow for single stair buildings up to 4 stories, which is, I guess, going to take the next step with their code staff to implement. Seattle, I think, is probably the most similar locality that has this, and I think this bill would essentially kind of model what Seattle's done with their buildings, where they have, single stairs, but they could only have like 4 dwellings per floor, and then there's other parameters too, and sprinkler provisions and other sorts of things. But I think there is a direct application in Arlington. We have not many zones where these would be allowed, because Arlington, again, it's mostly zones where you have like single family VHO zones, which wouldn't, like a single stair wouldn't be needed because those are capped at 35 feet. And then we have buildings along the corridors where they're much larger buildings. So there's like only a couple places in Arlington that even have a building that would be able to be a single stair. There's a couple in around in Fort Myer Heights that have 2 stairs, but they're like a four-story buildings, but have this law in place that could be a single stair. So it's not huge, but that depends on like Arlington, how we zone. If this were to pass, if this becomes legal in the building code, Arlington could make adjustments to make more areas where single stair buildings would be visible. It's the process to this. It could be, if it's just essentially this bill would whatever compel the building code to just be implemented faster, because again, this can be a non-code, this could be just an administrative change, but that could take looking at whatever the code cycle comes around, that could be 5+ years.
I think it's a 3-year process, and they just finished accepting like last year, like new ideas, and now it's going through the process again. So yeah, it's probably another like 2 or 3 years before they're even open to that. And I have no idea how much they even care about like suggestions from random people throughout the, like, it seems, I was looking at a similar thing last year with mold, and adding that to the building code. And I think I met with the state agency that oversees it, and I was like, wow, this doesn't look like we'd ever be successful in getting anything added to the building code. They seem to be very focused on like, we have certain constituent groups that we pay attention to, and we don't really care what anyone else thinks. Which is probably why the legislature is like, hey, this is important. I think it's a little tough to say like, hey, we recommend that you endorse whatever the recommendations from this group are, but we don't know what they are yet. Because what if they come out against it?
Yeah.
Which is a possibility. Unless we're just saying, hey, in general, we think the county board should just be for single stair properties, regardless of what the recommendations from this study say.
And I don't think it's that city's right. Yeah, I would have to agree, like, because we don't know what they're going to say, it's hard to like say yes or no or on it. I mean, it'll be interesting what it comes out of it.
Are there, how does this impact the elevators?
So you can still have elevators won't be affected. You can do a single stair building 6 stories with an elevator. Out like you can have or there will still be the building code with elevator, like egress, all these sort of things.
Because I'm thinking more so from like a accessibility standpoint. Because if you have a like 6-story building built today, doesn't it have to have lobby? Does it not?
I would assume, right? Is there an ADA?
Because it wouldn't be ADA compliant if it didn't have an elevator.
I mean, I understand their point is like, Europe does this, but anyone who's been to Europe, Europe's not really like ADA compliant at all. Like it's you're hiking upstairs and there might not be an elevator at all. And how was that about that? But
The idea here is you'd have 1 stair instead of 2 stairs, and regardless of the elevators, is that it?
Yeah. Okay. Which I'm not opposed to it. I think it doesn't make sense to me to tie our recommendation to the results of the study, because we don't know what the study is going to say. But I think we want to come out and just say we support changing the building code to allow single stairs for up to 6 stories, that to me makes more sense than, like, we think you should endorse whatever the findings of this study are.
Yeah, the big thing, what would push this over the edge, I guess, would be to get the firefighter groups. So this is where, the biggest, if like, let's say if we want to get this, the biggest hurdle I see is to get this passed is safety. It's a matter of, okay, fires, what happens if there's a fire, and this and that, and I think from the data that shows that like Seattle, they have their fires, deaths, and incidents are no worse than any other city. They don't have any special firefighting capability and whatnot. In many ways, these buildings are safer because they have pressurized. The stairwell needs to be pressurized. There's less distance to get the stairwell, all these sort of things. But the biggest ask here would be almost like not the county board pushing it, but if somehow we get groups of firefighters, like that would be then pass instantly. Firefighter, that's like the biggest thing. So,
are you opposed to reaching out to Arlington County Fire Department to ask their thoughts?
as a yeah,
I think that could be helpful because if we find out that they're opposed to it, the board is likely going to be opposed to it as well. If they have staff telling them no, it's safe, they're not going to accept it. But if they say they are fine with it or support it, then I think it would make more sense for us to seriously consider it.
Don't you think they will probably wait until the study comes out?
I have no clue.
Yeah, it feels like a little.
And that could be another track. I mean, it could be something that maybe we wait until next year. Because I feel like everyone is probably going to be waiting until the study comes out. But I also think if you have the bandwidth to reach out to the fire department and talk to them or the fire marshal, whatever, it would be really helpful to find out their perspective on it.
Yeah, which, are we still allowed to reach out to people and ask for information? Is that
Yeah.
hasn't changed?
That has not changed the guidebook. Do you know when what's happening?
I don't know if it has been implemented yet, but I haven't heard anything since there were a lot of comments, so I'm sure they're still going.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to go through Alex and have Alex ask session leadership, reach out to the fire department, you're welcome to do that.
Just in time.
But you can also just reach directly. Or see if
So
Alex.
for what it's worth, I think firefighters are split. I think there are several firefighter groups that are opposed, and I think there are others that are generally supportive. I don't know exactly how the locals feel, but just broad strokes, I think this is pretty controversial in the firefighting community based on my understanding.
So the study's looking at
yeah, that'd be
the main.
contention points.
Yeah.
I don't think people probably care about it other than this.
Right. Yeah.
Just cost versus safety.
The
Yeah.
Seattle did a study too. Said that in many ways they're safer because of pressure or something.
Yeah, so they have like if you look at the distance, but so these are the buildings that are allowed to be single stair. They're small buildings that would essentially fit on a single like 5,000 square foot lot, like a single family lot, and they're only allowed 4 dwellings per floor, so like 4 units.
Yeah.
And they have about maybe a couple hundred that they built since the code changed the past couple years or so. It's hard to see, and plus there's also New York City. I mean, they have the most. If you look at the most single stair buildings in New York City, but it's hard to compare because it's New York City and
Well, my head just keeps going to Twin Towers and how people died because of the stairwell placement,
Yeah.
which is not related to
Yeah.
this.
But I
that's
mean,
where my head
someone-
keeps going.
Someone will make it related.
I mean, if it's 4, which would make sense with some of these homes we've seen, they can be really high and it's a single family home. But yeah, but this is saying 6 stories, right? 6 higher. Yeah, I think that's where it could.
Has anyone else done 6? Or is this higher than
I
other?
believe Seattle is it's like 5+1 underground that they can do. And then New York City has gotten 6. Yeah, other countries around the world, they do like 20, 30. They don't do like it's like not wood frame construction. These buildings would be like wood frame construction. It's again under 6, you don't need to do steel concrete.
Okay. Do we just want to come back to that discussion next meeting?
Yeah.
Cool. Hopefully be able to hear from our local fire department. Inclusionary zoning.
All right, so I know we did talk about this last time to redo Arlington's affordable housing ordinance. And I think this could be just an addition that we do in terms of recommending that we update Arlington's affordable housing ordinance. And this would be to, if the county doesn't already have the power to do a mandatory inclusionary zoning with the caveat that perhaps all the units would be funded by the county or other means. So what this would mean is that permits the county to do an ordinance where we say, okay, we want to build, every beyond FAR 5.0, whatever, X% of units must, instead of being optional, what we have currently, must be 60% AMI or some other level that would have to be put in the building. But this would say, as long as it's funded, so like the county would essentially give a tax break to whatever the cost of these units would be to make them 60% AMI for whatever 30, 60, whatever 90-year time frame. And the reason why I think this could be interesting is that this puts instead of having the private markets pay for this, it would essentially be tax breaks. So we wouldn't be getting this funding. So it'd be essentially just that development. Okay, here's the money to actually fully fund these units. And I think this could be helpful because, Arlington, we could require a higher percentage of inclusionary units, either for bonus or mandatory if we got permission to do so. But that would come with the cost trade-off of perhaps seeing less buildings get built, which could lower the amount of overall inclusionary units that get built. So this would essentially say, hey, this provide another lever to pull to get more housing on site, but at the cost of everyone paying for it, except through like a tax, it's essentially like a tax write-off. So this could help in terms of producing more units, but it does come at the cost of this property is now generating less tax revenue. But I think that this could be a way to speed up housing production if we have the budget for it, or provide some other means that the county gets. So I think it could be beneficial to add into our ask to see if we want to get this. I don't know. The board seems to be very focused on lowering our office vacancy rate, commercial vacancy rate, and of course provide tax break. Well, that's less taxes, so it's kind of against that. But it could also, even with a tax break, it could still be net positive depending on how much housing is provided. Like it may be only a couple units, but then the fact that the building is being built in the first place could give that could make the building actually be built, and therefore it's rather be an empty lot not being built as proposed, not feasible for 5, 10 years, whatever it is, less depending on what the market conditions are. This would essentially get these buildings over the hump and then provide those IC units that we'd be missing out otherwise if there's no building. So I think it's a trade-off.
I'm a little unclear on exactly what this is and how it's different from like what we have today. So I'm looking at like the first sentence, bill would allow for locales to require new development with mandatory inclusionary zoning if and only if the units are funded with local, state, federal, other funds outside the development. So today we say if you want to exceed the zoning parameters for that location, then you have to take into consideration our affordable housing ordinance, which means you either have to pay money or build units on site or somewhere else. What does this do?
So this would say is, we could essentially, let's say, not saying we can't change the ordinance, the affordable housing ordinance we have, but let's just say we keep it the same. So let's say, hey, the county's gonna say, all new housing, in addition to getting this bonus density that the developer can get, by doing whatever additional stories or whatever, this would be saying, hey, you could do like say a flat rate. Any new development is going to have at least like 1% of the units are going to be at affordable at 60, 80, or whatever percent AMI. And then this would be funded through, they would get the tax credit for that percent, but not for the other ordinance. So this could essentially provide more housing without impacting any of the development feasibility or any of the other concessions that we could be getting for like roads or other things that are part of the package that was negotiated. So this would be something that the developers I don't think would really oppose this because they don't have to give up anything else. It would also, for the new development, provide the funding model would essentially distribute across the entire county. So it's like, instead of being applied just to new development, it's saying, okay, the entire county now is funding these IC units versus just the development itself, which is the new residents of this development and renters. So it provides a different trade-off that could provide more housing at the cost of revenue from the county.
Well, the developer doesn't have to pay anything.
They would get a tax break for it. And
How does the county like that the tax break that we're no longer getting is we get free?
so the idea is, let's say there's development that is like just not being built because whatever market conditions, it's been approved or other cases. This could be a way to get more housing without impacting that feasibility of that building being built, because you could say mandatory like 50% develop, I'm just saying really high number. That's not feasible. So nothing will get built, right? So, our ordinance bonus density can be tweaked to perhaps extract more inclusionary, CAF units or other things such as like roads or other things that they negotiate to, improve the area, sidewalks, streetscape, things like that nature. But this is saying, okay, if we really want to add more housing, but we want to make sure that we're not just throwing down like, okay, we want like 20% of all the new units to be committed affordable. This would essentially be funding that directly. So,
I'm talking about like because the county is gonna lose tax revenue, right? Because they're giving them a tax break. And people are talking about these programs being like fully funded. So like, is there like a proposal for like how the county will be able to like make up the lost tax revenue?
So
Are you saying from the development that would happen?
yeah, so potentially, like, depending on how much is the mandate, like if you just do a little bit, you could get a couple extra units because like the revenue that it generate, and this is kind of like tax increment district, like not like
Is
that,
this for all buildings, like including by right? Or this is still site plan?
site plan. So what this would do is just give, if not already, the option for Arlington to do this if they want to. So, and the trade-off again with this is like, yeah, this county's budget. It's like more money going directly to affordable housing, which obviously that's people's direct, like let's say if a building goes up and currently, Arlington will negotiate, and part of the money that goes to the improvements around the building and the affordable housing, that only affects the actual development itself. Like, let's say if you own a house like right next door up the street, those there's no like direct impact on, okay, I'm part of my tax property tax money is going towards funding these affordable housing. It's just that building, which is good. I mean, you can do that, but this would cast that net wider of funding housing to the entirety of the county versus just that new development itself, which is the trade-off. But I think it could be a potential beneficial trade-off. If the county people value that, okay, we do want to fund this and still get the benefits of the new taxes that are emerging from the new development, while still not affecting, like, putting in jeopardy of needing to get stopped or increased risk of projects of current and then future that get proposed.
But isn't this not really inclusionary zoning because it's just the government who's paying for it? Like, there's no burden on industry, whereas inclusionary zoning is like, hey, business has a responsibility to contribute to affordable housing too. And so, like, we're telling you that this is what you need to contribute, kind of your fair share thing. Whereas this says we're taking away that responsibility. It's just important that you just build. If the county wants inclusionary zoning, if they want cap units in that building, we'll just give you tax credits to pay for that. Don't worry, developer, you can make it billions. Like, the people will pay for this. Isn't that kind of what this is?
Well, so I mean, Portland, Oregon, they recently had a version of this where they did not like fully fund with the tax. They didn't have enough funding to do it, and they realized they weren't getting the IC units that they wanted. We'd still be getting the private developer contribution through our bonus density. And in addition to whatever, we update that to if we decide to, county, whatever we
So
get.
this is in addition to what we have, this is not a substitute.
This could be addition to get the housing built. And like Portland, so far, I mean, it's very recently that they've done this. It's been a huge deal that they've been able to fund this, and they get state money. Like Oregon has given a lot of money to localities to do this sort of thing as well as locally. That's why I think it could be being asked to get certain money from the state to do this, but because when you just again focus on, okay, the developer, those costs they do get passed on, and they're mostly affecting the new residents, new renters that are in the market or moving into the building. This building, which is not, I mean, that's a trade-off that happens, but it could be a good one. But I think that this is a different trade-off, and that really kind of puts the entire community. It's like, do we really want more housing at this level? Okay, let's chip in a little bit and really bring in the entire community versus just, hey, we're gonna.
So I'm not, if this is an additional tool that the county has, not like opposed. If it's a property tax credit, legally, can the General Assembly do that without changing the Constitution? Because I know a lot of, like, you can't exempt someone from property tax without changing the Constitution. Can you create a property tax credit without changing the Constitution?
I don't know about that. I mean, this is why I just kind of, I've seen how it's, and it's like, New York, for example, they do, I think it's called like a 421B or credit where that's how they get affordable housing built. They have that, in Philadelphia, they have a 10-year like abatement for storage. Like, they do all these sorts of things. Like Arlington, we don't really do this because, again, our kind of, I guess, philosophy is that these are cash cows. We don't want to be giving tax breaks to what makes. But I think there's some room to do this adjustment to say, hey, we have a lot of buildings right now in the pipeline that are vacant parking lots right now. Their site plans are delayed. We're at perhaps our lowest level of development we've seen in many, many years. this could be a way to say, hey, let's kick in some of this funds.
It's an interesting idea, but I guess I'm still not understanding like where the money would come, because the county is still paying for this just in the form of tax.
They would just have
Right.
less general fund revenue.
Yeah.
So we just, as a county, have less money every year to spend. Because
So
in
that
theory,
never be budget. Right?
well, in theory, you're spending the money through the tax credit program on affordable housing through this program. So you're basically like, the
So this
county,
will still come out of the affordable.
it would, no, it's just, they would just have less tax revenue.
Yeah, so like, how's that?
Well, because the county's like, okay, well, we could either spend that money on AHIP and get this amount of units, or we could spend that money through this tax credit and get this amount of units. They're still spending the money either way. It's just one is spent through tax credit, one is spent.
So why is Portland talking about this program being funded?
Well, the thing is that what happens is, they have like a pool of money that they, like it's budgeted, like this money is budgeted to to give the tax break. So like, for example, like, let's say there's, like, this is the ideal scenario. Let's say we want to get like 10% of all new housing units, whatever, to be inclusionary zoning. And there's a lot where only like 8%, like let's say that, we do the negotiation, the developers as well. If it's 10%, we can't do it. If it's 8, we can't do it. This would be, okay, we're going to kick in that whatever it is to fund that remainder 2%. And then instead of that being a vacant lot, earning like virtually no tax, it becomes a building, and now it earns us. So it's not going to earn us as much property tax if we didn't give the credit and they just built it, but it's going to give more property tax than as a vacant. Like that's the idea.
But okay, I guess that does make sense. But I guess in Arlington, are we having issues with like that issue of development not happening? Like, isn't that kind of what the problem would need to be that these developers aren't going to build any housing at all, right? In order for this to work. But that's not the problem, right? The problem is that they're not building affordable units.
Yeah, well, part of the problem is that the developers, when they enter the site plan process, they have to undergo negotiation with the county between what they're willing to pass off, and one of them is the affordable housing ordinance, as well as the other things like contributions to utility upgrades, easements to build sidewalks or parks or other various things. And this, again, it's kind of like at the margins. It's not going to magically make all the development that's sitting vacant, that's maybe approved in the past couple of years, or that is not feasible now, but all of a sudden if we did this, it would become feasible. But around the margins, it could help deliver more inclusionary units at 60%, 80%, whatever, without making a building less feasible.
So maybe are you saying that, like, based on now the status quo, it's not necessarily going to make things more feasible, but it will give us more affordable housing without making it less feasible?
Yeah, it will, because again, this is the trade-off. The trade-off is we'll lose some of the tax, the full tax, like it'd be coming from our budget, but it could easily be able to, it won't affect feasibility.
So why use property tax credit as the mechanism as opposed to just have the county buy units in the new building and say like, okay, you're developing 430 new market rate like rental units. The county wants there to be affordable ones, so we're going to purchase 10 of those to be CAFs. Why not? And the county doesn't do that currently, but they could. They could partner with like APA. They're like, APA, we're going to give you $10 million so you can buy these units in this building. The developer doesn't have to agree to it, just like they wouldn't have to agree to the tax credits. But like we could do something similar now with existing authority. So why is this, in your view, better than the county just saying like, hey, we want more units in your building, it's a prime location, we're gonna pay you for those units.
Yeah, I don't think it, I mean, I think that'd be the same thing, just purchasing, it would just be different mechanism.
But is the county more likely to use the mechanism that you described versus the authority that they currently have but don't use?
I mean, it could be kind of semantics and you know what, but I think it as a way to get.
But if we're gonna propose it, it
Yeah.
matters, right? Because
Yeah.
we don't want to propose something that even if they got the authority, they wouldn't use.
I'm not sure, again, I'm not 100% sure, but you know, that they have this authority to give that the tax, but that's why I'm proposing, like, whatever. It's there not to say, hey, like, this would be a good tool to have, if, you know, the county would say, hey, let's, you know, this has 8%, we want all new tech, whatever.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting idea. And like my questions on it is because like when like I meet with the county lobbyist to like have a follow-up conversation and like, you know, Matt and Susan, they're gonna be like, why? Why are you proposing this? What benefit is there? If we could do this already, why would we need this? And if I can answer the questions, they'll say, okay, well, thanks for sending us the letter. We're not gonna move forward with these, but you know, thanks for your time on this.
And I don't think, you know, again, in terms of the, like, let's say we were to make a really high number and really lower the taxes, I don't think Ford would be supportive of that, but I think there would be a case where saying, you know what, it's not gonna freeze as much as we would, but it will still do more than the base case scenario, which is kind of, so I think, but that could need a study, it would need, of course, a lot of research.
I do also think this may be unconstitutional. Just because like I was looking through some other tax credit stuff that I'd worked on before, and they're all income tax like credit programs for property tax. I'm pretty sure the Constitution mandates like exactly what that is, and even the General Assembly doesn't have the authority to change that without using a constitutional amendment. Because like when they wanted to give veterans like tax credits on their property tax or something, like they've had to change the Constitution to do it as opposed to just creating a program that does that.
Yeah, I was just reading that part of the Constitution. I don't see anything about affordable housing. They have things like senior housing or like, you know, something related to the environment. But I don't see an affordable housing part unless you can interpret it a certain way.
I think there's been a push to make affordable housing tax exempt. I mean, if it's owned by a nonprofit, then exempt from property tax, or you're exempt from income tax. I don't know if you're exempt from property tax.
Not exempt from property tax.
Okay.
Yeah, well, that would be nice.
But I mean, that's something I think that's been talked about is making like affordable housing exempt from property tax, but don't think, like, I think Apple and all the rest of them have to pay property taxes on that. But that would certainly make it much more affordable to do affordable housing to pass a constitution like it's saying they don't.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, no, I just, you know, just kind of, you know, putting this out there, not, this not in the, it's not out there, it's just kind of like, oh, I'm just thinking about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
No, it is. And much better to have this conversation now than when you're meeting with like one of our senators and then they're grilling you, you're like, you are not prepared for this. I'm not a professional lobbyist. I don't know what you expect from me. But yeah, if we, and the tough, like usually when I propose like housing stuff, like I check with like my housing lawyer friends and say like, hey, would this be unconstitutional, or like, is there any reason why we couldn't do this? And then, but there's like a bunch of, I think before we can flesh out that stuff and like say, okay, yeah, we want to move forward with this, like there is that additional research that is helpful just because those questions are going to come up and the county's going to ask the same things if we want them to seriously consider what we're recommending. And that's why to some degree it's helpful if we're going with it's already a bill, you know, like we know someone's already come up with it and we're saying, hey, we want you to back this. And typically when I've been successful in getting legislation like passed, or even like the one that we've included and they've had as part of their legislative priorities about the enforcing tenant rights and protections like locally. That was because a bunch of other advocates adopted it, worked with legislators and other lobbyists, and like did all that stuff. That when you're a resident volunteer is tough to do. But I'd like to make sure that legally this could happen without changing the Constitution, which I'm not sure that we could. But maybe like, Richard Tucker or I always forget. Yeah, Russell.
The nurse router.
Yes. Would be good people if you want to meet with them to ask.
Good.
Yeah. And also a little taste into life as chair. It's just like, oh, let me go meet with all these staff and gather this information. So the fun part of the stuff in between meetings. But no, I think I appreciate the thought that went into it, and we should be proposing new ideas. And but we also just want to vet and make sure that we're sure that this is something they can do before we push it. Other thoughts on this one?
I mean, I'm not super. As we've seen in another one, developers looks like they'll always get money and not do shared affordable housing. In certain buildings and certain locations. When that comes to instance, so yeah, I just hope to make the developers make money. So it's not like they're money. Yeah. Everyone's gonna go to providing cash and building or not building where affordable housing needs to be. And that's my only thought on that. It's just how to or to not have one location always have the affordability.
Someone should come up with a really great idea for how we turn the Roslyn Marriott into affordable housing, and also a gondola location going to Georgetown. That would be awesome. Any ideas? It's been condemned now, right? I think it's officially been condemned. Yeah. But yeah, it's frustrating when developers close down the existing thing. I was just reading about on Columbia Pike, where that like Turkish restaurant used to be. The same thing happened. Carl now is doing a story on it, but it's a plaza, and they like closed all the businesses that were in the plaza because they were going to redevelop, and then they have redeveloped it. It's been years, and now it's like the ceilings are collapsing.
Oh, is it the one near the draft house? CVS Center.
I think there is a CVS there. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And the
I mean,
neighborhood's just
also,
like, hey,
don't you know that developers
maybe-
get tax breaks? They can have that and saying, oh, well, things cost too much and we shouldn't be paying it. Taxes are made for businesses. Don't let anyone else tell you otherwise. They are made to not pay the fair share.
You guys want to talk about rent stabilization? Yeah, appreciate did you add this or was this already here?
I just updated a couple things in there, so we're happy to talk, or if you want to talk about what you want to propose or.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the rent stabilization that I've been looking at, so Darius Clark has a bill that he's introduced the last couple of sessions that would give localities the authority to cap rents. And I'm not sure exactly the mechanism that he proposed, like where it happens. Often you have a body that they set up that sets this is what the rent cap is going to be for this year, and it changes from year to year. they can set. And I'm not sure if his bill did, because I had actually worked on my own version of the legislation a couple of years ago, but in some places you see a minimum. So the state will say you can't cap it any lower than this amount because they want to make sure the localities don't say like 0% rent increases. It'll always be like whatever the CPI, pegged to that or something. So that's kind of like the mechanism. And again, it's something that's focused on not freezing rent, but capping rent increases to prevent rent gouging, which if you talk to people who live in Arlington is a fairly frequent occurrence. Like lots of people have said, like, my landlord's raising my rent by 20% this year, which is absurd. And part of the reason why arguments against it and say, well, developers just won't build. If you say you can't increase rents by 20%, and let's say you say, the cap is 15% or 10%, I don't believe that developers will be like, well, then we just can't afford to own property in Arlington. And the studies that I've seen have said that rent stabilization policies are incredibly helpful and impactful for the people who live in those units. And that they do successfully keep the cost of rent down. Where I've seen more negative things are when they've gotten rid of rent stabilization, they've showed that then the rents like go up like by extreme amounts on the units that previously were rent capped, which makes sense. And I think is also an argument for not removing rent stabilization policies like I think Massachusetts did. So what you've written, like I've seen a lot of this, the arguments are that if you put rent caps on, then developers will say, I don't want to build here because it's not cost effective for me to. I won't make enough money to make it worth it. And I certainly think that there's places where that's the case where it's not, that they're already so close to it's not profitable that putting something like this in place would stop further construction. I don't think that Arlington is a place that if you did rent stabilization, I mean, DC has rent stabilization for like older places. And they have rent control for some older places too. And you still have lots of development in DC. And I don't think Montgomery County as a whole is going to stop having development happen. So I'm very skeptical of the data that says if Arlington were to do something like this, because the state allows them to, then we would lose new development. Do I think it might have an impact and slightly less is developed? Sure. You'd have to look at it from a perspective of like, we need to make sure that what the caps are does not discourage people from doing development. So they have to make sure they're high enough to not stop that. But I still don't think, like, how do you justify 20, 30% rent increases from year to year? Like, and claim that that's, the developers need that to make money. Because that's not true. Like, they're.
Well, isn't there right now, there's a lawsuit going on for that real page? For doing, like, analyzing what developers are charging. There's this whole big thing that is still in the courts, but it has to do with real page software.
They set rents, like, yeah.
Yeah, type of, and who knows what's gonna come out of that, because, yes, developers are charging crazy amounts.
Well, and you hear it from developers too. Like, I've talked to people who develop like the Shushan Group in Arlington.
Yeah.
And they told stories about they're building a new building. And when they built it, they thought that rents would be at this level. And then when they have like the company come in that tells them what you should set rents at, it's way higher than they thought. and that they did all the development based on this much lower rent, and they're like, well, I guess we're gonna charge a much higher one because we can. That's how they do business. It's not, well, this is what we have to charge to break even or to make a little profit. It's just like, what can we get away with? And that's what I think rent stabilization is trying to stop. The big thing for me is, it is the number one thing when I talk to Arlington residents that they say they want housing policy wise. They want the county board to do something about how fast and high the rents are increasing. Because they're like, I can't afford to stay here with these massive increases. Which to me carries a lot of weight when you have like a lot of the other policies that we consider, maybe helpful, but they're not the things that people are asking for. And in large part because they don't know, they don't understand how a single stairway, bill is going to eventually help, with more housing and things like that. But like, I do think it's important to consider that if the number one issue that I hear, I don't know about you all, when talking to people in the community, is rent is increasing too much, too fast. And you have a policy that will allow the local government to restrict how fast and how much it can increase, that we should be considering that.
I mean, I agree. So maybe just understand, what is the difference between rent stabilization and rent control? Or is it?
Rent control freezes rents. So that's where you have like New York City apartments that the rent in 1970 was like $50 an hour or $50 a month, and the people living there today still pay $50 a month. That policy is an absolute failure, because what you see generally, not like necessarily everywhere, but like DC had huge problems with this, where the landlord just said, I can't afford upkeep on this building anymore. Like, I get so little in rent that like the ceiling's collapsing and I have no money to fix it. So I'm just not going to, and the city can go ahead and condemn it because there's no money to do anything because I'm not getting any, rent to support it. Rent stabilization says, we get that. We get that your expenses as a landlord increase year to year. And we're okay with you increasing rent, but only by a reasonable amount. And not this like, 20-30% increases that we see. That's ridiculous. But typically in a lot of the rent stabilization policies, that have to look at Clark's bill. You have a process built into it so the landlord can justify a higher increase. So you may set the cap at like 5%, like rents in, and you say which types of buildings. So typically new construction is exempted from it. So you say like buildings that are 10 years old or older, this applies to. But you would say like, okay, you did massive renovations in the past year. Sure, you can go up to 15% because like you provide justification that your costs were much higher and you need that to recoup your expenses. But yeah, the idea that like adopting rent stabilization in and of itself will stop development. The landlords and the developers will certainly say that because they always lie about crap like that. But I think if implemented in a reasonable way, it is beneficial to residents and it does not harm landlords and property owners.
I think another thing, I agree with you, and I think another thing, like as a commission, I mean, this is just my opinion, but like a lot of what we talk about tonight is more like upstream policy, right? Like looking at creating more affordable housing like options that will impact people like in the long run. But also thinking about policy that impacts people like where they are right now, I think is important. And like I think as like I think a lot of us are like in the policy space professionally and like as advocates, I think it can be like easy to, think about the upstream factors a lot and like and be in like planning mode for like 10, 20, whatever years down the line, because that's, where policy thinkers are. But like, I think rent stabilization is like Helen was saying, like it's one that would really have a huge impact on Arlingtonians like right now or whenever it's implemented. And I think it's important for us as a commission to kind of balance those two things. Like, what can we do for folks now? What can we do to make sure there's affordable housing and access to housing in the future? And I think that something like rent stabilization is a nice like downstream practical policy that we can support now.
What was the policies that I've seen where like the parents have the apartment, like maybe it's rent control, which is bad, but then they're able to pass on their children. And so with the same kind of like amount, and then
It's usually rent control.
it is
Yeah.
rent control, okay.
Where, families, like New York City, the generations pass down the same
Yeah.
very, very cheap unit.
But it's like huge, just like a 3-bedroom in a nice area.
And no one's really like, localities aren't really passing that anymore, right? It's usually not more about rent
Yeah,
stabilization.
I mean, so the term rent control, generally by people opposed to rent stabilization, they call rent stabilization rent control.
But it's two different.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
It's an umbrella term as well. Rent control is an umbrella term.
Oh, gotcha, okay.
All rent stabilization is rent control, but not all rent control is rent.
Yes.
But like, if you're talking to a landlord, they will absolutely every time refer to rent stabilization and rent control because they want to scare people and they want to make people think the worst about it. So you will never hear someone associated with the landlord industry refer to rent stabilization as rent stabilization. Always call it rent control. Part of their PR campaign against it.
And do you mind if I?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I really appreciate this. It's a great discussion. I think and I'll point out some things that I'm hearing and just take it to a practical manner of sort of things that the issue that we're feeling. I think everyone is feeling these crazy rent impacts. Supply is not there. I think that's a fundamental issue. If there's 80 houses and 100 people have jobs that want to live here, it doesn't matter what you got to have 100 whatever houses. So, but the thing is that when you look at rent stabilization policies, is that they do have that benefit that whatever it is, let's say you establish a cap of CPI plus 5% or whatever, that the yearly rent cannot go past that. But there are a lot of different effects, and I'm just gonna point out some of the different ones, and I think bring them to the full discussion because if you set, let's say, a price cap at like 5% flat rate, there could be times where, unless you're building a lot of housing, there's lots of supply where the landlords could only raise it like 2%, but because there's the cap, they're gonna every year you're gonna get like 4 or 5%. So over the long term, you could essentially be paying more. So rent stabilization is what I've seen. It's not necessarily more of an affordability policy per se, because if you look at the long run, because it allows more like this, the market. It's more of a insurance policy, but that's not the same as
if it stays the same every year. Whereas I think the model that Clark proposed localities set a new one every year, so they could set it higher or lower depending on what the market conditions.
Yeah. So CPI plus, but even in that case, then if it's like CPI plus like 2, you're still going to get where unless you have what's called rent banking, where if you put lower than the cap, whatever that CPI is, you could bank it for future years. But that's again the impact of long term. Is this look at huge rent spike. If you don't have the savings, it could be bad news. But if you look at average rent increases and decreases compared to CPI, a lot of times these rent ideally you wouldn't need you would have enough supply, you wouldn't need that. But I just want to talk about again we have. In Maryland, of course, Montgomery County and Prince George's County are looking at implementing. Montgomery's a little bit further ahead, but already in, for example, Tacoma Park, the city of Tacoma Park, they have a rent control, rent stabilization, that's what they call it. But it is a fairly aggressive one. They have, they set yearly what the rent increases are going to be, and it affects all development like 5 years and older. So it's a pretty aggressive one. It had virtually no apartments have been built since 40 plus, almost half a century now. And this is unfortunate because this is an area where it's right by a metro station. It's a great location for new housing, and they've seen huge impacts to this. They've not had any private investment come in. They've lost 40% of their 25 to 34 people that were living there in just a decade. And what's one of the effects is that when you have this really aggressive policy, you're not going to get that investment. And in terms of our greater region, how is the city of Tacoma Park helping our region bring in enough housing, whether that's new affordable units as part of the market rate, and it's right by a metro station. There should be lots of housing that can be built there, but there's not. And then I want to just again talk about a great comparison in Minnesota, where the city of St. Paul, they had a referendum to do a rent stabilization ordinance, though they did it, and they did it. This was a pretty, again, strict. It was a strict 3% increase. It was no new buildings were exempted. And it turned out it only lasted a year because it's not very good, because they saw a huge drop in permits compared to Minneapolis. And this was during the Minneapolis, boom, when they were building a lot of houses. They just passed their own misdemeanor ordinance. And, you had this sharp contrast between Minneapolis, which didn't have one, and St. Paul, which now implemented this policy that they've reversed, and they've gone back to, like, I think it's a 20-year exemption, and they added, the CPI plus a certain number. But, there's a lot of exemptions that they need to do, and it's turning out to be very problematic. Minneapolis also passed a referendum to look at rent stabilization, and the city of, and I think this is, I didn't include it, but it's in the my thing where I linked it there. And I think this is the best comparison to Arlington. The staff report for Minneapolis, they did a staff report, and they were like, okay, do we want to do a rent stabilization? And they found that they looked at all the costs and pros and cons of what it would do, directly impacting their budget and their housing production. And they found that the first thing was that there is that yearly administrative cost that they need to do to run the program, which they deemed would be, they did two scenarios. One scenario was the original St. Paul scenario, which is a 3% max per year and no like decontrol. So that means that no matter what, if you got a new tenant, you'd always have to keep 3%. They kept like their original modeling, and then they did a more, I guess, less forceful kind of typical stabilization, exempting like 30 years, decontrol, where you could raise the rent if the rents are left, that sort of thing. But I'll just go through some of the numbers that they modeled based on the more or less strict one. So a typical, what we're seeing in, I guess, Montgomery County and Prince George's, where they have the 30-year exemption for new construction, that sort of thing. And they found that just to run the program, it would be $1 million, which they determined like the opportunity cost of that would have been 33 units at 50% AMI. So, just to run the program. And they found the 10-year cost on the city revenues to be between 461 million to 735 million, which in direct city revenue would have been 39 million to 75 million. And, these are, pretty, these are pretty big impacts. And then they did the impact of new construction units, and that was a deep decline over the 10 years between 9,000, about 10,000 units to 18,000 units, which is a decline of 20% to 50%. And then they did the impact of existing units that would be in the rental market and go off the rental market, because this is also issue of rent stabilization when you can no longer be profitable in your building, or you can't cover your capital costs. Big issue of condo conversions, which is you take the unit off the rental market and make it a condo, put in upgrades, and then you don't have that rental impact or rental market. So there was these, I think, large impacts that would play into Arlington, as Minneapolis found, and what St. Paul is currently grappled with right now. And when you look at Arlington rents, I mean, they have been rising. Another thing about the policies that So Arlington, we do have, I think we do have essentially rent control with our cap units. And I think a great example is what we have in Barcroft, where, this is a win-win-win across all segments of Arlington's population because Barcroft got a lot of money invested, private sector, public sector, to essentially control these units, all 1,300 units. And everyone there, no matter what their income is, even the 5% above, 80% AMI, if they want to, will be able to live there for the remainder in a unit, and which is really amazing. But we're also getting the benefit of the new development in Market Rate. And we're getting these investments in the road network and all these sorts of things that if we just said, hey, Barcroft, we're just going to cap rents, we're going to run into all these problems where we're not going to be getting this investment to renovate the units. And I think that the CAF model is really great because it's so targeted. Because what happens is when you do a rent stabilization and they found this with the St. Paul, the study that was done, when you cap rents, what it essentially does is it transfers that value that the landlord could have done to the renter, which can be a good thing. The renter is gaining that value. But what the study found is that the people that were getting the most transfer in this, the gap in between what they were getting capped at and what was actually being, the actual rent they could get, the people benefiting the most from this were the areas with higher education, higher incomes, and higher white population areas. So if we were to do kind of a similar thing in Arlington, the buildings that see the fiercest pressure of rent are along our metro corridors. So if we do, it's very tricky to do these blankets rent policies where you're capping off what the landlord can do. You could essentially be locking in existing residents, which is, if you look at our regional housing economy, doesn't really fit a good equity lens because you're essentially being people already privileged enough to be in housing in our corridors. Not to say that people in walk-up buildings along lower demand areas would still see some benefit, but that's just an example of how inequities play out in the markets. And another thing is that when you cap rents, you're also, studies show, increased tenure, which can be good if you like your apartment. But what happens is that landlords, they can increase other aspects of the apartments, like they can increase parking, they could do other things to kind of kick you out per se, not fix things up or not invest as much in the building as if it was market rate, so they can get a better return, especially if there's vacancy decontrol where they can get a new tenant to pay a higher rate. But what happens is that, let's say you're in a building and you're in rent, you're being price capped to whatever, but you want to find another building because let's say you have a kid or to find a new building that fits your needs. Now you could have a harder time in the market to find a place because, no one else is going to want to give up their controlled unit because they're going to have to pay a higher price. So especially for 3-bedroom units, it's going to be very difficult, and it will make it harder for people to enter our market, which is, I think, what Arlington, we pride ourselves in being open and inclusive. And if we say, hey, we're not saying we're going to do the full Tacoma Parkway, but Tacoma Park, they have made a policy decision where, they have not built a single apartment unit, but they have provided rental caps, which certainly kept the rents at reasonable levels, at the expense of investment in their properties. They have, their housing stock is very old, and they don't have any private money besides what they get from the state. It's like Arlington, if we decide to, hey, we're just gonna, kind of lock things down, that provides it really hard for mobility to come into Arlington and within Arlington to move around if you get a new job or whatever. And it impacts our ability to increase revenue, which is directly related to building more CAF units. So, yeah, it's a lot of things, but I think there are a lot of really real negative benefits or negative impacts, unforeseen impacts that it doesn't address that root cause of like, okay, I want to I like my apartment and I want it to be, not being gouged on rent, which it certainly happens, but I think there needs to be some more data to show like, really how much is it happening? Because if you look at the averages, and this average, um, past couple of years in areas where there's especially a lot of housing being built, if you look in our um, region, the places where the housing has been the most flat is where they're building the most number of units. In Arlington, the corridors is, it's gone up, but I think over the long term, it's managed to stay fairly decent compared to areas that are not building. And you're seeing this in the statistics of who's moving to Arlington, the total number of marked units. It's gone up in the past. It's ticked up. So there's a lot of different things like at play, and I think that it's not to say like, oh, we're like heartless. We're not going to give out this. We're not going to cap your rents, but it's like that's not necessarily going to help, and it could make things a lot worse. And then if you do all sorts of exemptions, you're also creating like this dichotomous marketplace where, let's say, I did the research, like it's based on when buildings are built. If you exempt like buildings built like before 20 years, you're essentially going to keep half of the market in our metro corridors be wide open. So you're telling those renters, hey, sorry, you're not in a controlled building. You're free to the market. You better find an apartment older than 20 years if you want to get that stabilization.
But we are seeing that now. We're just saying, go move to Montgomery County if you want rent stabilization, because we're not going to protect you here. So that message is still being sent. We're just saying, sorry, we're not going to help you. We're focused on these policies that hopefully 50 years from now will make it much more affordable to live here. You may get priced out in the meantime. Sorry, sucks to be you, which obviously is not your fault, is not any of our faults. But I think that's the challenge when we talk about, again, the downstream versus like the upstream. Like a lot of our solutions are, we're going to try to shape the market in such a way that like decades from now, we hope we have enough housing so that it brings rents down and it makes it more affordable to live here. But who knows, like this area could become way more popular 50 years from now, and even more people want to live here than there's housing. And we just never achieve that no matter how much we build. And I think the challenge, what you bring up, absolutely right, that you can screw this up. You can royally screw this up. Same thing with inclusionary zoning. If you make it too expensive for developers, they just will not build anything. So I don't think that's different than rent stabilization, other than, in my view, you have to make sure that you have the right data and that when you're crafting the policy, you're doing it in a way that accounts for, okay, we've studied this and we know that if we do this, people are still going to build, that developers are still going to move forward with projects. But if we go too high to this level, that's when things are going to stop and we need to be careful. So I completely agree that there's risk. There's risk with rent stabilization, but I don't think there's significantly more risk than with inclusionary zoning.
But then the thing is like, it's right. So let's say you want to decrease the risk. You put in the 30 years of exemption, you put in the CPI plus like, whatever, but then you're essentially not covering, you're going to have a scenario where, like, let's say you're to backdate the policy, you'd be the market rent would be lower. So you wouldn't be doing anything.
Can I make a comment? So I think I really appreciate all the the research you did and just into all the possible unintended consequences. It's a lot to think about, and I often refer to this book that I read by Shane Phillips called The Affordable City. That's really helpful, and I think his main point of the book is like you need a variety of different strategies for affordable housing, and the three that he mentions are supply, stability, and subsidy. And he's basically like, you kind of, there may be trade-offs between like supply and stability, being like rent stabilization type stuff. But his idea is like you need both. And if you just have supply, then it doesn't help like maybe the existing renters who are having their rent raised too much. And he does recommend rent stabilization, but with these, moderate, like, policies like excluding the 25 or 30 years new development, or, letting them raise the rent when somebody moves out and someone new is gonna move in. So I definitely, I think I agree with him that, it is helpful, like, especially if we are targeting the older buildings, people who are gonna live in, like, the older buildings are generally the ones that are more affordable, so I feel like that is a form of targeting to the lower income folks. And, I think overall, just it's so, like, it does provide a really big benefit for people, to not have to have a predictable rent. Like even myself and my friends, like my friend across the street had her rent raised by like 25%, so she has moved out. Like luckily I've been fine so far, but I'm like, oh no, like I don't want that to happen to me. So anyway, I do support it, but I think if we include, it should have a moderate kind of things to it.
And maybe the proposal is a study, because I do think that Virginia, one of the things from talking to like the landlord community and other people who are so opposed to this, and they bring out worst case scenario, like literally the economy will crash in the state. We do this and people will just start dying in the street.
There.
If I think having actual data from people looking at Virginia, our economy, our development trends in our state, would be super helpful. So if that means like proposing the General Assembly, similar to the single staircase thing, does a study, granted, I wouldn't want the Youngkin administration to do the study, but like having a third party, like neutral third party do it or something, I think that would be helpful to have like better data in a more localized context. I mean, I'd say too, like I think Arlington County should do its own study. And I brought this up a couple of years ago. There were a number of board members who did not support rent stabilization in general, didn't want to study, didn't want to do it. And who said like if we had the authority, I wouldn't vote for it. But I just think like you talked about increasing tenure. Would love to increase tenure in Arlington. And I don't think it's fair that property owners have essentially fixed mortgages, granted property taxes, change from year to year, your assessments change. But renters should have the same security that like the 40% of homeowners get in our county, and they shouldn't have to worry about you. Like, are they going to raise my rent by 30% next year? Do I have to find a new home? That sucks. And that there's mental health, psychological impacts of that. People feel invested in their community if they know that I may get kicked out next year. And I have zero control over that. So those are all things that totally get what you're saying. And I do think, yes, like the data is really important. And if this were to move forward, making sure that you're designing a policy that is taking into account potential negative impacts, of which there could be many, I think is super important. But I just think like not bringing it up or not moving forward with something is telling people, sorry, we're not going to help you today. Because we're already picking a segment that we're already saying, 60% AMI, we're going to try and build subsidized units for you. Everyone else, we have nothing for you. Like,
and there was something.
Yeah, but I'm like,
housing commission meeting last week.
Yeah, but beyond that, like, it's just like, hey, glad you're in Arlington. Hope you can continue affording to live here. But if you can't, you can move someplace else. And
how about the thing is, I fully understand that policy. The thing is too, we have to look at people. We have obviously Arlington. We got to talk to voters and the residents. But then there's like, what if you want to come to Arlington? Are we going to have? I'm not saying this is a fully nativist, but the immigrants, the people that want to come here, well, they're not going to be able to find that 3-bedroom stabilized apartment because that person now is, especially if it's a strong stabilization, they're is that fair? We're going to close. I'm not saying this is like, but it does have that negative output of we are going to prioritize the people that already live here, which there are people that are struggling here, no doubt, but there are also people that are commuting from hours away. They can't find housing they can't find, they're moving away. And we're just gonna say, hey, we gotta put Arlington first. I'm just saying that's what that policy is essentially doing, is saying, hey, yes, market impacts, but I feel like it's just like to me, it goes against some of our core principles of like, for every stabilization policy you do, you get an equal effect of people leaving because they can't get a stabilized apartment or they can't find it, so they're going elsewhere. So, like, I don't know what you tell to those people that are going to be exempt. Like, sorry, you can't come here. Like, we're gonna prioritize Arlingtonians first. And I get that. You want to, their voters. They live here, but at the same time, there is some sort of obligation that we have. Like, we don't have enough people to work here to live. Like, we need to be drawing people in, not taking the approach of that. We're going to do this broad-reaching policy. And I'm not saying that, everyone that they're dismiss people saying, "Oh, my rent's gone up by like 25, 30, whatever percent." Like, that is based on the average. That is a couple standard deviations away from whatever the averages have been. So I don't. It's very conflicting to say, hey, we're going to do this policy that is going to really have negative impacts on our production of CAFs, on our property values, to produce CAFs, to produce the housing that we need to welcome more people in at the expense of keeping people where they're at and perhaps reducing their own mobility. What if you want to move again to go to a 2 or 3 bedroom? You can't do that. You're going to be in the situation where you have we already have huge mismatches in a county where we have people in 3, 4 bedroom homes with households of 1 or 2 people. And it's not saying, oh, we can't just kick them out, or like we need to be hyper efficient, but there's a really big trade-off that stabilization brings, and I have not seen it work in any locality that has recently passed, especially I think the Minneapolis example, this Minneapolis area, St. Paul. We don't need, it really is not going to have the effect that people think. And I'm not saying that people are ignorant or dumb, but like, this is going to have a lot of really far-reaching effects that's going to hurt a lot of people that really need the help. And I can't pit renters against each other. Like, to me, in my mind, it's like, why can't we should be building more CAFs, building more housing to let them into Arlington and be welcoming, not say, oh, we can't build housing, so we're going to lock things down. And then,
but they're going to have to leave in a year because their rent went up too much and they can't afford to stay. So I feel like not doing it also doesn't solve the problem, and building more CAFs and housing overall will not solve the problem fast enough. Yeah. It's still forcing people out of the county in the meantime. And we see that all the time with low-income communities, especially, that like they're leaving the county because they can't afford to stay.
Like Barcroft, if you're saying, if we had just said, I'm just saying, hypothetically, we did get a lot of private, Amazon fund, all these funds. But like, let's say we do similar policies to other areas. People in Barcroft are going to be better off with this. It's essentially, funded. They're getting rent stabilization because they got this funding. They're getting this investment. If we just say, hey, people living in older buildings, we're gonna cap rents, none of the benefits of what's happening to Barcroft are going to happen. You're not going to see this investment.
But we're not going to stop doing Barcrofts.
Yeah, because when you do that, it does impact the ability to produce market rate units.
It might impact it, but doesn't necessarily make it impossible.
I mean, we wouldn't do it if it made that impossible. I don't think anyone at this table would say, if the county came back and said, well, if we adopted rent stabilization, we would never have another market rate unit created again. We'd be like, yeah, do it. Like, I think we'd all be like, oh, well, then we probably shouldn't do it. But I don't think that that's reality for Arlington. I think we still would have, maybe it's a little bit less than what we're getting today, but if what we're getting today, but not necessarily, like,
it would be. Like, Minneapolis, they did a study.
But this is not Minneapolis. Wasn't DC like really well shielded from the 2008 housing crisis?
The whole area was.
Yeah, that's what I mean when I said DC.
Yeah,
Like, I don't know what, I know there's like sister cities and certain studies, you can say it's more comparable, but this is not Minneapolis. And Kellen brought up that it is working in DC. Right,
We're already seeing now
in some places.
the pipeline of development in DC it's fallen off completely.
But it's also fallen off here too.
It's also fallen off here. You know, I'm not saying it's not going to stop. Doing a moderate, Montgomery style stabilization, 30 years, no decontrol, all that sort of thing. It's not going to stop development, but there will be a large impact.
Is that necessarily a bad thing if some people won't be displaced?
Like,
What about the people who are here now?
But we don't even know
Yeah,
that.
I mean-
Because if we do, so I'm just saying, if we do a policy of, let's say, CPI, so like, let's say 2000, I'm looking at the 2022, the CPI was 10%. So if we did CPI plus 3%, that'd be 13%. Landlords could raise 13%, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to what everyone's saying. Well, Helen and Nikki, this isn't Minneapolis. Like, this is Arlington of 26 miles. Like, so the density is a lot different because I did look at the density compared to Minneapolis to here. Very different. The history is very different. People that live there are very different. In this area, we have the highest numbers of educated people with bachelor's degrees in this area. So that's why you have Amazon here, Google here, or all these other companies. And so I don't think that the federal government here. I don't think that development is going to cease to exist or no one's going to build here because the market force is here. Unfortunately, things might be changing over there, but probably not. Minneapolis, it's cold. Like, but like,
agree on that.
yeah, when you think about things too, it is just different. Like, I grew up in Arlington. I stay in Arlington. I died, but like, I don't, and I've seen the changes, and it hasn't stopped. It's, I think the big thing is COVID just blew up office buildings, blew up hybrid working, blew up how people want to live in general. So I think there's so many other factors that we should do a study for Arlington in this area. Well, Arlington, let's just say the DMV area. And I'll be honest, I've lived here almost my whole life. I can't even tell you how often I've ever been to Coma Park. Like, it just, and I'm just reading kind of their history, like, they might have just done it to themselves with this, the way that it's not working. They have policies that you can't cut down a tree or you have to get waivers and stuff. Like, that's kind of ridiculous. Like, how does that help development? Where you have to get a waiver for this, a waiver for that. So there could be other factors that play into why it's not getting developed as here. We don't know that because we don't have that information. So I would strongly support, let's do a study, like, how can it work for Arlington? It needs to work for Arlington, for this area, the people who live in this area, the people who live in this area, who commute to this area, because it's going to be different.
A study doesn't have to be part of our legislative priority, because if we're asking Arlington County to do it, it doesn't need, like, it's not really part of the state legislative priority, so we could just do a separate letter to the county saying, this came up, there was a lot of discussion about it, we think more data and information is needed. We also think it's really important for the county to have that information so that they can decide, should we ask the state for this authority? And then the state can also use that study to say, hey, in a place like Arlington, this would be either very beneficial, or the data comes back and says, actually, this would be, like, pretty catastrophic, which I don't think it would. But, like, I think this study, instead of talking about Minneapolis, talking about Tacoma Park, we would be talking about Arlington and the data that whoever they hire you know, gathers, I think that makes sense to move the conversation forward. Because this is part of the problem that I always face when talking about rent stabilization here. I chat with people, we pull in examples from all over the place, and we try to, and I think this closely fits Arlington and what I think would be happening, but I don't know for sure. And not that a study would tell us for sure exactly what would happen for Arlington, but I think it will move the conversation along much more definitively than looking at other examples of things.
Yeah, I think as long as the study really is not necessarily a forward-looking study, because I really want to make sure this is a neutral, like, let's lay the cards on the table. Let's see what this would look like, and not say we're doing a study to preempt. Okay, this is going to be good, but like if it turns out to be, for example, like I'm just saying, if it was at the magnitude of the Minneapolis study, based on those assumptions that they put in of that development, we should say, okay, look, this is not going to work. Versus trying to frame it as, oh, this is a good thing. It's like, look at the study.
I don't think there's any danger of the Arlington County Board or any jurisdiction in Virginia moving too fast with rent stabilization. This is Virginia. Democrats in the General Assembly do not even fully support rent stabilization. It keeps dying in committee, even though Democrats control both houses. There's so much work that advocates need to do to advance the idea of rent stabilization. The fact that we have a bill that's been introduced for like the last 2 or 3 sessions is already much more progress than we've ever had, even though that bill keeps dying immediately, because people were afraid to even introduce it before. So, yeah, I don't think there's a danger of that. I think the county, who is very sensitive to the development community and what they need and what they want, is not going to be like, I don't care what developers say, we're going to go forward with this anyways. So I don't think there's a serious danger of the county like having it be like, I need you to come back and tell us it's going to work. Like, just find the data to support that. I think they would, if we could even convince them to do it, which in and of itself would require a pretty massive effort, even outside of the Housing Commission, if we all supported it. Because it's a third rail, like they're just doing a study, the board is going to get a bunch of flack from the landlord community and from, and I'm sure national groups would come in too and be like, how dare you?
And I know there's a lot of hate, and rightfully so, landlords wanting to exploit, but I think the framing that it's just evil land, like that's not, going, I think we need to, I'm not saying it's horrible, hate on the landlords, but there's also other groups that have seen the impacts. There has to be some like tacit acknowledgement that it's not simply just, not say that the landlords and builders certainly are vested interest to keep away rent stabilization because they want to invest, make money, but there are also other groups promoting housing affordability that have seen these policies not produce their intended results and be inequitable. So I think that it's, we need to make sure we're framing this not like, oh, housing is not affordable because evil developers are not doing this. I think we just not say that there are some nefarious actions taking place, but I think we just need to make sure that, when we frame our conversation of rent stabilization, it's to fully acknowledge, okay, there are benefits. There's no doubt there are certain groups of people that will greatly benefit, but there's also people that will not benefit. And that's not just because of evil, wealthy people. It's because of that's what the policy does. Policies have effects, markets have effects. So I think that just needs to be taken into full consideration.
I do think one of the kind of counter arguments that I feel like you brought up yourself, like counter to sort of your own argument, is like average rents are not 20%. I think you do see more so bad actors who are the ones who are doing the 25, 30% increases. If the vast majority of units would not be impacted by this because they're already just doing incremental increases, how could it have this catastrophic negative impact on the economy and on development? If it's only like a fraction of buildings who were doing these bad, massive increases, why is it so scary for everyone if we said like you can't increase by more than 10%? And most of them, at most, I do 5. So this doesn't even impact me. Like, why is it so scary to everyone?
It's the investment. It's like, I mean, there is this, even if it's exempt, it's still a signal, because if you're an investor and you're a housing developer, okay, you're going to build a locality where you can get your best return, where it's safe. And when you start doing policies that, oh, my return is now at risk, that goes into the calculation of building, these. I think it's not as simple as like, you punch the numbers into the spreadsheet and like, oh, this works. There's like when we got, the CoStar, for example. I mean, not to say that CoStar's, I mean, they've had a lot of history of negative and various things, whatever, but like a lot of that's just like relational. Like that's just building like, hey, come to Arlington because we treat businesses well, handshake. So, when you send signals to the market that, oh, we're serious about this, and your development now is not covered, but you could impact your returns, that does play a factor where you take your limited capital, which what we need to produce CAFs and other housing for the market, because the person that would have lived in a building that was a parking lot before, they're taking the spot of another building that could have been someone else. So that's what I'm saying, is that the impacts are there. So I think we need to be conscious of that.
Which is understandable. I'm not super sympathetic to the argument of rich people won't get quite as rich and we need to be worried about, like, LIHTC is a great example of a program that has been very successful. But it bothers me in principle because it's just like, how can we make Goldman Sachs more money than they already make? We're going to pay them to pay for affordable housing because they can't be bothered to actually spend real money on it and take a hit, doing something that's good for the community. We have to just pay them for it. Which is why, like, public housing makes a whole lot more sense, but Arlington, that ship has sailed for Arlington essentially.
Again, that's what's so, I'm just throwing out, it's like, what's so bad about, like, taking like the Tacoma Park, for example. No developer has made a profit there. At the same time, they've lost 40% of their 25 to 34-year-olds. What decade? They've gone because there's no, Tacoma Park is not a place of opportunity. It's a place of single family homes that are, whatever. And then you have older housing stock that only gets federal money. They're way behind on capital needs. And like, is that a model we want to direct Arlington to? And just,
I don't think anyone
turn away
we should adopt what Tacoma Park has done. Like, I think you're taking an extreme example and saying we shouldn't do that. And I think we all agree we shouldn't do that. I think we're interested in exploring something quite different than what they've done. And I think that's the case for rent stabilization, that it's the details matter. How you implement it matters. It's not just rent stabilization good or bad. Rent stabilization could be good and it can be bad depending on how you do it. And I think we're saying we want it to be good. But understanding in some places it has been very bad because they did it in a way that stopped investment and stopped development. So yeah, I don't think we're in disagreement that Tacoma Park has probably done it bad, but I think we're interested in exploring how Arlington can do it right.
And I think the thing we could propose is perhaps maybe, this is just what I'm not saying we could, I'm fine, whatever the commission wants to do, as long as, if presented to include all the discussion of it, but I think the board should be looking at what's going to happen to Montgomery County, Prince George's County after, see, like, they're doing this. Let's take a look at it, see what the impacts are, and see, they definitely should be looking at it. But I think
COG would be a great organization to study it, to look at. We have some COG members who have done it, and we have some that have not. Let's look at the places that haven't, how this would impact them. Let's get the places who have. But that would still require Arlington or someone else to pay for it. But yeah.
Could we add that as an agenda item to our next housing commission meeting of discussing whether to recommend study?
Yeah. Yeah.
Might need 2 September meetings, but yeah. Or honestly, 3.
I was gonna
Yeah,
say, I
other
think
people,
we
yeah.
should try and wrap it up.
Yeah, but it does sound like we probably have moved away from considering this for a legislative priority item and more so as a separate item for the housing commission.
Yeah.
Which happy to work with Alex to find a suitable time on an upcoming agenda to have that conversation, because I know more than just us will want to discuss and weigh in on this. Yeah, I mean, Joe is also very much against rent stabilization, which
Yeah.
National Realtors Association
Right.
hates it.
I think it's good, that we're having, it's a good discussion.
No, it's
I
great.
mean,
enjoyed it.
but I'm not against it in a matter of, principle, and because, I really, love to see some more data on, okay, what can we, because we keep talking, oh, the rents are, the rents are out of control. There's no question, but the thing is, like, I think before taking, again, this is where, be more amenable to do study or certain things, talk about other impacts first before really advancing, okay, we have, like, using this sort of language that we really need to go to do this. I think if we do that first, let's see and make sure we take everything, take the impact seriously, take the benefits seriously, and really, look things through. But I mean, yeah,
Makes sense. So for the next meeting, can we get in advance like a full list of all the things that we talked about, and then maybe use the next meeting to like cross off some things that we don't think are higher priority, not necessarily get down to like 3 items. Honestly, I think we should have 4, because I think the Virginia localities enforce tenant rights. My thing is, it's already on the legislative priority, so we should include it in our recommendation. But I don't think that should take up its own. That should be like a 4th one. Sure. And then we can come up with like 3 new ones.
And another bill, I'm just saying another idea that would not be rent stabilization, but like, for example, a warn notice. So like if your rent is going up by more than 15%, instead of 30-day notice, you get like 60. Things like that. That can still make it easier to find another place, or, versus, I think there's different options along the scale to.
There's so many things when it comes to tenant rights.
Yeah.
Just cause eviction, like banning or like implementing just cause eviction law.
I don't think more notices solve the issue of displacement.
No, but it would. I think people would very much.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's
Like-
not a worthy cause, but like, I don't think it's necessarily the same level.
Oh yeah.
Can I ask, so last year, did the board just pick one to recommend? How many of our priorities, like, and which one was it?
They had already for several years now. They've had the localities have the authority to enforce tenant rights and protections.
Mm-hmm.
With the other things we recommended, they didn't adopt any of them.
Okay, so that's why you're saying 4, like 3 new ones plus that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also with it, like, it just, I need to do some more prep work with the board and with their like staff lobby. I can't remember her name offhand, but because it's very easy for them to get these and then ignore them. So you kind of have to like put it front and center to be like, no, please think this through. Let's talk about it. And then, okay. Because I think what I saw last year was they hadn't really even looked at what we sent. And maybe Matt had sort of glanced at it, but the rest of the board never looked at it. And then I think when I met with the staff person, like, she was like, well, I mean, staff has already sort of given a list to the board and that's what we're going with. So yeah, it just takes some coordination to get it on their radar. And it helps when outside groups are asking for the same thing, or multiple commissions are asking for the same thing. So maybe after next month, when we have like our bigger list, we can share that with like the tenant landlord commission, at least them.
But just before the other list, I think we did approve to carry over, like, we gotta keep that list there. I just don't want to. The recommendations are those.
The ones from last year, right, and put the new ones that we talked about on that list from last year and bring it to the full commission.
But so far tonight, I don't think we've had anything. But we're good. I think we agreed last time that those were good, right?
Yes,
So-
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, so I'll bring the full list.
And when's that next meeting?
I'll send out another.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll run the list past you, like before, to make sure we're good.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, because we had the 4 from last year. I mean, we had a bunch more that we considered last year, but ultimately didn't include.
Well, we had the 7 we talked about last time, too,
Mhm.
which I think is some of the ones we didn't wind up including.
Yeah. Okay.
A great discussion.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we need.
Oh, party.
But no, because it's not.